electric cars. Sales of conventional internal combustion engine cars peaked in 2017, and there is no sign of a return. The recovery of global car markets since the pandemic has been driven exclusively by sales of electric and hybrid cars. In 2024, about 1 in 5 cars sold were electric, whereas last year we saw a jump to 1 in 4 cars. Now, there are multiple reasons, of course, for the rise in electric cars, but chief among them is the strong policy focus that the Chinese government has placed on the development of the electric car industry. And building up domestic electric car markets and industry was a means for the government to address both of these structural challenges. Now, today, you can see the outcome of that process. In China, only around 1/3 of conventional cars are produced by Chinese manufacturers, while much of the remainder is from joint ventures with international car makers from Europe and Japan in particular. But for electric cars, the picture is very different. More than 80% of sales in China are from Chinese electric car makers, by and large a result of industrial policies, such as low-cost loans to manufacturing scale-up, strong supply chains, and the development of advanced battery technologies, which have its roots in dedicated innovation policy efforts. Today, China's electric car market is very large. Last year, around half of all cars sold in China were electric, particularly when we look at 2024. And this is in part because electric cars in China are able to compete on price with conventional cars. For international car makers operating in the country, this shift towards EVs poses a major problem, as the Chinese market has become a huge source of their revenue over years. But it's a problem that is currently being exported elsewhere as well. If we think, for example, of Southeast Asia, which is a key market for the Japanese car industry, for example, and is a region as well where they have established significant local manufacturing capacity, what we've seen is a rapid increase in sales of electric cars in the region, jumping from 9% in 2024 and in the first half of 2025, already reaching over 15% of total car sales and trespassing that threshold. This is very much driven by imports from China, which has contributed to lowering electric car prices in the region. If we take the European Union, for example, as another region, which is home to some of the largest and most established car makers in the world, what we see is that the region is responsible for 15% of global car production, of which roughly half is exported. But here, too, electric car producers from China have made inroads, which now supply nearly 20% of total electric car sales in the region. Now, the car industry is not only about the big car companies that we see all over our roads. It is a whole universe of different suppliers for the several hundreds of components and subcomponents that are required to build a car. Car makers usually purchase the entire components from so-called Tier 1 suppliers, which is in turn are buying as well from Tier 2 suppliers. The market size of car components and parts, it is worth around $1.3 trillion, roughly 40% of the entire car market size globally. These suppliers are key players and major employers in this industry. They also often have large R&D budgets to continuously improve their technologies, even though they tend to have lower margins than car makers themselves. These industries have grown over the decades as the conventional car industry has also grown, and for internal combustion engine components, such suppliers are generally headquartered in the traditional car producing countries. Companies from Japan, Europe, and North America are far and away the largest producers, as you can see in this chart. Now, this is also true for all those other components that are not related to the powertrain, ranging from seating equipment to air conditioning systems. But it is not true for components that relate specifically to electric cars, as you can see in the slide. Electric cars have a simpler design. For example, internal combustion engine cars require 5 times the number of moving parts as electric cars. And what we see is that the production of components for electric powertrains are mostly controlled by companies headquartered in China. Other than China, Korea and Japan are also home to companies that have an important role in the battery industry, but North American and European companies are nearly absent from that picture. Now, a wider shift towards electric cars is therefore said to have a transformative effect, with far-reaching consequences, not only for the car industry, but also for its supplier and the wider economy as a whole. Car manufacturing is a highly integrated industry. Car factories are often co-located, as we've mentioned, in industrial clusters, where assembly plants, component plants, material production plants, all work together in an integrated manner. This means that the inputs that go into car manufacturing are very often sourced within the same country, or at least within the same region. The share of component imports in many markets has been increasing in recent years as the supply chains have become also more global, but imports remain relatively low. And in Japan, Korea, and the European Union, less than 15% of the inputs for car making are imported. In the United States, the value is somewhat higher, but this is mostly because of the integrated nature of the North American market. The car industry is also a major demand center for upstream material production in many advanced economies. One or over a tenth of steel demand in the European Union, for example, and in Japan is used within the car industry. And often these are high value and high tech steel products, which are a very important source of revenue for that specific industry. The same is true, but at even higher shares for the aluminum industry, as you see in the slide as well. And the car industry is, of course, also a major employer. For example, 6 million people are employed in the European Union, and nearly 1.5 million are employed in Japan. Employment does not come only from the direct assembly of cars, as we've mentioned before. The making of parts and components is often an even more labor-intensive process and accounts for an important share of manufacturing employment. There are, of course, many other jobs related to the automotive sector that aren't shown here if we think about retail sales or refueling and so on. But what we found important was to show that the jobs that are connected to vehicle manufacturing in particular. All of this just to say that the car industry plays an important role in many car-producing economies, and for the reason, that specific reason, governments are keen to understand the implications of growing EV sales in their domestic industries. So with that, I'll hand it over now to my colleague, Leonardo Paoli, which is going to be discussing some of the key drivers of cost-competitive EV manufacturing, as well as some of the opportunities for improving that competitiveness. I'll hand it over to you, Leonardo. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Araceli. So just one second to move my slide. Here we go. So for the incumbent car industry and for all the countries that host it, the market uptake of electric cars has become a major preoccupation. This is because this has been a revolution in the technology and in the market. Something that we have seen is that pure play electric car makers have taken around 45% of global electric car sales in 2024. And this includes companies such as Tesla, as well as many Chinese new entrants. And also thanks to this, China has become a global production hub for this technology. And there are multiple reasons for this. Some of them were already mentioned in Araceli's speech. But a key one is that producing cars in China is generally 30% cheaper than in most advanced economies. This is true for conventional vehicles already, and we can see that the main cost difference comes from the assembly and the cost of normal components for a car. And the reason for this is mostly relatable to lower labor costs, because both the step of assembly as well as the production of some of the non-powertrain components are very labor-intensive processes. However, while we know that lower labor costs do matter, we also see that in China there is a generally cost-efficient industrial and logistical environment, which really contributes to these lower costs. Something that we know is also that for energy prices, they are lower in China than in other regions. However, according to our assessments, these only account between 2 to 4% of the direct manufacturing costs of a vehicle, and therefore, according again to our numbers, they do not really explain a large share of this cost advantage that is seen in China. However, if we move to electric cars, we see that the cost advantage increases significantly when we look at the production of cars in China, and that is because battery prices are more than 30% cheaper in China than, for example, in Europe, and 25% cheaper than in the United States. Unfortunately, we do not have any sort of market price that reflects to Korea, and it would be really interesting to know more about the prices that are observed by manufacturers in Korea as well. And since the battery accounts for such a large share of the cost of an electric vehicle, this influences the competitiveness of producing in China. The competitiveness gap is really quite significant. And this comes from the fact that China has built a highly integrated supply chain over the past decade, which spans from the refining of critical minerals to the production of battery components and the assembly of the final vehicle. All of this means that in China, this very large EV market share, which is over 50%, is driven by the fact that 2 out of 3 cars that are sold in China are cheaper in their electric version than in the internal combustion engine equivalent. Whereas when we see in other regions, the difference, or let's say the price premium for an electric car, still ranges somewhere between 15 and 40%. So the lower manufacturing costs are a very important explainer for the competitive edge of the Chinese electric car industry, but it would be wrong to think that this is the only advantage. We have noticed that Chinese electric cars have in particular some batteries that have very, very high technical specifications that sometimes beat those of many international rivals. In addition, the vehicles themselves tend to be highly digitalized and offer attractive options for many consumers, especially in emerging and developing economies where customers tend to be younger and more open to new brands and new technologies. there are many, let's say, and another key part of what explains the Chinese success is related to the policy environment that China has created for the electric car industry over the past more than 20 years. And in fact, the first let's say policy document that mentions electric cars goes back to 2001. And a key characteristic of this policy environment is that it really has looked at all the different aspects of the supply chain. This includes many demand side policies, but also many supply side policies, which includes policies related to the generating a critical mineral industry, policies related to let's say fostering the national battery manufacturing industry. This is something that has actually affected around 2015 many of the Korean, let's say at the time, largest players. And all of this together has really mattered to generate this very, very large domestic market and this large industrial ecosystem that I was mentioning earlier. And of course, all of this is very, very important. However, one of the key points, at least that we think is important from our analysis, is that even though it is absolutely true that policy and government support have been fundamental to develop this industry in China, I think looking at the situation today, it would not be 100% correct to say that it is only because of government support that Chinese producers have very strong advantages, both on the production of electric cars and on the production of batteries. They have really built now a technology and an ecosystem, and they have become an innovation powerhouse. And this is now really the main driver of Chinese success in the electric car industry. Now, this is what we're seeing today, but if we go back just 8 years ago to 2018, we see that the price of batteries in China and the United States was roughly similar, whereas Europe was already behind, and actually data only starts in 2020. What is important is that not only the price was roughly similar, but also let's say the cumulative experience of battery producers was more or less the same, because in 2018 China was already home to many manufacturers, but it still wasn't at the technological frontier. Whereas at the same time in the US, the partnership between Panasonic and Tesla was really pushing the boundaries of the economies of scale for battery manufacturing, and they were at the frontier of battery chemistry. However, since then, the pathway has begun to diverge. And what has happened is that on the back of a very strong domestic demand for batteries and EVs, Chinese firms have built a lot more batteries. They've built a very large cumulative experience, and this has contributed to having lower costs and lower prices. There's also two key drivers of the Chinese battery company success. One was really focusing on innovation. China has become an innovation powerhouse related to clean tech. Today, it is the country with the largest number of clean energy patents, and 95% of energy-related patents focus on clean techs. And when we look at specifically batteries, Chinese companies have focused on LFP chemistries, and these are chemistries that are intrinsically cheaper than the alternatives that have instead been developed elsewhere. And thanks to innovation, the performance gap between LFP and the nickel-based chemistries has become much, much smaller. The other key point, which was already mentioned, is that Chinese companies have massively scaled the entire supply chain, which goes from the material refining, but also other elements such as the production of battery-related machine tools. And all of this has become a very specialized industrial ecosystem that is hard to match in many other regions. Now, what does it mean for energy security and supply chain security? This very large success of the Chinese battery industry has become a risk. We have tried to apply, let's say, a type of analysis which we call the N-1 analysis to the battery supply chain, and this is an analysis where we try to see what would happen to the EV industry outside of China if the Chinese supply became unavailable for export at different stages of the supply chain. So here, to give a clear example, any bar that reaches 100% means that production capacity outside of China could be sufficient to make up for demand of EV batteries outside of China. And as you can see, for some steps, which include lithium refining, for example, but also the production of nickel-based batteries, there is in theory sufficient capacity outside of China, which could in theory make up for a supply shock. But there are other elements which include graphite production or even precursor materials, both for nickel-based batteries and LFP batteries, where production outside of China would be impossible without Chinese inputs. And it is very important also to underline that the supply chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So really the lower share here tells us, let's say, the margin that there is for the security of the supply chain. Something that is also important, what sort of underscores the importance of this type of analysis and these supply chain security considerations, is that over the past few years, the Chinese government has announced has announced and sometimes introduced export controls for the supply chains of battery components, and they tend to target those steps that are particularly vulnerable for other regions. It is also important to say that a very large share of many of these bars that we're seeing are, say, the production capacity outside of China. A lot of it tends to be by Korean firms and in Korea. So Korea is really one of the main, let's say, alternative suppliers to China for the global battery industry. And the last point I wanted to make is that actually in these export controls, they do not just target the product, but in many cases they target the machinery that is used to make these products, which means that if these export controls were fully implemented, it would be very difficult for regions outside of China to build up their manufacturing capacities, especially for technologies where Chinese producers tend to have really the technological edge, such as those related to LFP chemistries. One of the key analysis of this report relates to understanding really the cost gap from a bottom-up perspective, trying to understand what is it that determines these very large production cost gaps. What you're seeing here is a simulated, so based on our models, cost of production for a nickel-based battery cell in the European Union and in China. And what we're seeing is that, especially for the case of the European Union, but actually nearly everywhere, except in Korea, probably in the whole world, is that we see a large share of this cost difference coming from differences in manufacturing efficiency. Many of the factories in China operate at very, very high yield rates. They have incredibly high degrees of automation and digitalization, which were achieved thanks to large investments in innovation, but also, and most importantly, in built-out experience, in many years of generating a skilled workforce that has the experience to run these factories. As I mentioned, this is not unique to these abilities are not unique to China. We did this estimate also for Korea, and here the manufacturing cost gap, according to our estimates, is a lot smaller, of course, because Korean players are some of the largest, and there's been many decades of experience of producing this technology in Korea. Something that is also quite interesting is that when we look at cost of production in the United States, which is of course one of the key markets where Korean companies have invested, we see that there is a cost of production that is not so different to what we see in the European Union, because again, there's not been a buildup of a skilled workforce over there, and also there's higher tariffs for the intermediate components. And therefore, we see that the cost difference is very high. However, in the United States, there are these tax incentives which change the situation significantly. Let's say the second point that we have here in the graph is these materials and components. We are aware that purchasing some of the critical minerals in China is cheaper. However, we don't see this as being one of the key reasons for the differences in cost, at least now that critical minerals are fairly cheap. Instead, we see the cost of producing the cathode and anode material is indeed much lower in China, and this is mostly because of energy prices being so low. So this is really a point where energy prices do matter for the supply chain. Now, what does this mean for many countries that do not have a battery industry? And so how should they think about this? Because while it is possible to at least make this cost gap smaller over time as experience is built out, it will still take time for other countries outside of China and Korea to be able to build up a competitive battery industry. And what we're seeing is that actually, if one imports completely a car, only a very small share of the value of this car stays in the country where it is sold. On the other hand, an assembled car, even without, let's say, the battery elements, would still retain a significant large share of the value to be retained in the country where it is built. And this means that therefore international trade for battery components could be a very interesting way forward, at least in an initial step. And this means that, again, for these regions that lack a strong battery industry, it is really important to partner with some of the best-in-class battery producers from other like-minded countries. So to finalize, we've put together just a list of opportunities and considerations for governments and industry that wants to look at developing a domestic electric car industry. And here are some of them. So the first one is relating to economies of scale and learning by doing. Making cars is, of course, an established industry, but for many EV models, these are still producing comparatively small numbers outside of China. And so as per any technology, increasing the production volumes would help spread development costs for the new EV technology over more vehicles and lower these costs. Another element is related to the scaling up of the manufacturing capacity for batteries and building up related skills. As we know, it takes over 5 years for a new factory to reach nominal production capacity. So it is something that will take time to build a battery industry. And so for governments that do not have this, it is important to navigate this phase through potentially time-bound production incentives, as well as support to the battery industry skills build up through investments in education and innovation. Another one is related to securing a dependable supply chain for critical minerals. This is particularly important for those countries that do already have a battery industry. We're seeing that critical minerals do not necessarily account for a very large share of the cost. So it's really a question of access and making sure that critical minerals will be able to flow into the factories where they're needed, irrespective of the situation of the market or geopolitical situation. And therefore, governments could help develop win-win partnerships with raw material exporting countries to help support diversification of the supply chain. And we are seeing many governments actually moving in this direction. Another element that I think could be interesting is this idea of focusing on lower cost chemistries. The competitiveness of the mass market electric cars really depends on low cost batteries, and LFP Technologies does exactly this. It is a low cost battery that delivers enough technical performance for at least, let's say, for mass market cars. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is really a technology that is held by some and few Chinese companies. And so this could be a very interesting, let's say, area where innovation outside of China could focus on, and sort of supporting knowledge transfer could be important. And then last but not least, minimizing energy cost. We have seen that energy costs are not a key determinant, but they do matter. They do matter on the margin, and they matter in some specific energy intensive steps. And therefore, being able to manage these and keep these at bay is something that could help improve the competitiveness of the industry overall. And with this, I would like to finish, and I look forward to questions and engaging discussion with you. Thank you very much.
If I may add a quick introduction, the speaker who just presented was Mr. Leonardo Paoli. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yes, thank you.
He's a co-lead author of this report and a senior clean energy technology analyst at the IEA Energy Technology Policy Division. So thank you, Mr. Paoli, for the insightful presentation. So now we have time for Q&A. Please type your questions in the chat box in English, or you can speak directly in English by using the raise hand feature. Does anyone have a question for Mr. Paoli? 질문 있으신 분들 채팅방에 남겨주시거나 손들기 눌러주시면 영어로 질문해 주시면 됩니다. So we have 2 questions here so far. So Mr. Paoli, please take your time to answer those questions.
Thank you. I can maybe answer the first question, and then the second one, I think Araceli would be best placed to reply. So the first one relates to, if I understand correctly, slide 6. If I may just check. Okay, so on the overall cost of production. So here we were considering an NMC related battery chemistry. So this was considering really equivalent vehicles. And in terms of what model, we did not use a specific model, but rather we focus on, let's say, a specific, a segment of a car. So specifically a medium-sized SUV, so SUV C category vehicle, which tends to be one of the highest selling segments in most regions globally. And we try to create, let's say, a comparable model as much as possible across the different regions for our assessment. then whether the cost advantage is temporary one or not. So here I think that the 2 points sort of go together. There is, as we saw, even for internal combustion engine, on a purely cost basis, China still has an advantage, again, mostly because of this sort of low-cost industrial ecosystem. But the battery element is something that, at least, I think over time, the gap is likely to become smaller, because right now we see this very large difference in cumulative production in China. We see that there's been really a big advantage, and let's say a first mover advantage in a way. There's not really first mover, but let's say first industrial scale mover advantage in China. And over time, as different regions build up their capacity, they will generate a workforce that is more experienced, potentially collaborating with different countries that already have this experience, and so the cost gap should reduce for the battery side. Of course, we do not know what might happen in the future. There could be other elements. So to keep in mind is that there could be new step changes in technology, which might in a way set the clock sort of start again. So if new breakthroughs come through in China that are not available in other regions, then we might have this cost gap continuing over time. So it really will be a question of how the technology develops, as well as how the global market develops. Related to the IRA support, so as you've seen in our assessment, the cost, so that without the tax incentive, we see a very, very large cost gap between the United States and China, but also compared to Korea, for example. Of course, over time, so if it stays for a decade, potentially that is sufficient time to build out sufficiently skilled workforce and industrial ecosystem that will make efficient battery manufacturing in the United States also possible. So this is something that potentially was also in a way also some of the objectives of this policy is to build an ecosystem in the United States that makes these industries competitive there as well. So it is something that is possible, but it will depend on how that industry develops, and it will depend also on the volumes that are produced in the United States. And I think this answers the first question. So maybe for the second question, I will leave the floor to Araceli.
Thanks a lot, Leonardo. Just on the question around more broadly how the current stability and the conflict we're seeing in the Middle East, how it's impacting some of the markets. Certainly, I mean, if anything, this conflict has revealed the dependency on fossil fuels of today's energy system, and has brought more to the core issues related to energy security. We are following trends very closely, particularly in the area of electric vehicles, for example. So we just released for peer review this year's edition of the Global EV Outlook last Friday. So it's something we are really looking very closely in terms of, to which extent some of this current stability in energy markets and focus on energy security could be accelerating the transition that we were seeing already towards technologies that wouldn't depend on fossil fuels. And this would be particularly true for countries that would be dependent on fossil fuel imports. So we'll be monitoring very closely these trends, particularly over the last month or so, to really understand whether that's an inertia or a trend of acceleration that we expect to kind of see moving forward and to retain in the system. But certainly the current situation is looking at countries looking at other alternatives. And maybe this, just to relate a bit to some of the questions that are also popping up after these ones, there's a mention towards more on the hydrogen space. So how Korea could be looking at their hydrogen policy in response to these challenges that are highlighted in the Global Hydrogen Review in terms of higher production cost and certainty on demand creation. So that's something that, of course, my colleagues on the hydrogen side would discuss in more detail in the next block of the webinar. But just to mention that, of course, when we talk about putting at the core energy security and looking at opportunities to diversify the energy mix and looking at different options away from fossil fuels, again, we put everything into the mix, including hydrogen as well. But of course, technologies that are already at sizable levels in the market, like electric vehicles, we expect to carry on with that inertia, and that would be a kind of let's say a strategy that can be implemented in a shorter period of time, having more meaningful impact. But yeah, certainly we expect a shift from this that we'll be monitoring to understand whether that's going to be something more in the short medium term, or whether that's a bit of a step change that we expect to remain in more the following years as well. And I think there were some questions also on lithium-ion batteries, chemistries. Do you want to talk a little bit about that one now?
Yes. So this is an interesting question, and of course, knowing what's going to happen in the future in terms of chemistry development is very hard. I think something that is something that I've noticed over the years is that really the speed of development of battery chemistries has become very, very rapid. And I remember myself making assessments of, for example, sodium-ion batteries back in 2019. They seem to be a sort of let's say, early 2030s technologies, and then we've seen that in just a few years these have been developed and commercialized. So in a way, this very explosive, let's say, in amount of investments and technological expertise that has been built out in China over the past few years has really revolutionized also the scientific community and and how the technologies are developed and at what pace. This is what I was mentioning before, that we cannot know what will happen and how this let's say disadvantage in China might happen. One could imagine if in 1 or 2 years Chinese companies manage to commercialize solid state batteries, for example, this would again put them at a technological frontier at a very big advantage compared to others, and this would have a very, very large effects. At the same time, this same new technology that would have much higher energy density could be developed in other regions, and this would rebalance the situation again. So it is really a dynamic environment, both on the industrial side and on the scientific side. At the same time, we do see that the cost of lithium-ion batteries now is so low, and the technology has become, in a way, so well known and produced at a mass scale, that any new technology really has to, and any new chemistry really needs to beat a technology that is already great and is already proven to be good enough and sufficient to generate mass adoption of electric cars. So, of course, innovation will be very important. It could change everything, but in a way, focusing on continuous improvement of the existing technology is also something that will have a very, very important role in the years ahead. Related to hybrid vehicles, I'm not sure exactly which type of hybrid you mean. Is it plug-in hybrids or hybrid in the sense of internal combustion engine hybrid? But for both of them, we see, of course, a future for both powertrains. Let's say the disadvantage of the plug-in hybrids is that they will have always 2 powertrains, and therefore, even though they can be considered a more useful product for some consumers, it is unlikely that they will ever have cost advantages over either the full battery electric cars or the internal combustion engine vehicles. So because they're just more complex. So they're likely to always remain a premium segment, or not always, but I say going forward, they're likely to occupy the premium segment of cars, but it's unlikely to be a mass manufactured technology. A new trend is related to EREV, so extended range electric vehicles, which are also hybrid vehicles in a way, with just have a bigger battery and a smaller engine. These could also be potentially like sort of interesting solutions. But again, so far we've seen these to be mostly in the higher end of vehicles. If instead we're thinking about hybrids in the sense of internal combustion engine gasoline hybrids, these will of course have an increasing market share and will most likely eat in the internal combustion engine, let's say normal internal combustion engine market, because they have significant efficiency advantages. And therefore this will be particularly important, especially in regions where EV move at a slower pace. There is another question. Should I answer this? Yes. Yes, so there's a question on long-term policies and let's say the relative importance of innovation and consumer-related policy, and whether this is still useful in other countries to think in this long-term way. Very interesting and difficult question. So I don't think there is necessarily let's say, a more important one within innovation and the consumer side. In a way that really the winning strategy in China has been the combination of both, in my assessment, because other countries have done just the consumer side of the policy. So we've had very large, say, incentives for electric car sales in many OECD countries, very, very large subsidies as well. And these have, of course, been useful at achieving their main goal, which is increasing the sales share of electric cars. And of course, there's been let's say an innovation policy, say for EVs also in other regions, but maybe a little bit less accentuated. The winning strategy of having the two things together is that really the increasing sales were also helping the domestic industry, and the domestic industry was continuously getting better, and therefore helping the domestic sales increase. So it was this virtuous cycle that was enabled by having the two things together that in a way was at the core of Chinese success. The long-term strategy, I think, was particularly important when electric cars were a technology that did not exist. So when it was really about pure innovation and creating a new market out of nothing. And that's where this long-term policy that took decades, which is decades, is the time that is needed to bring a technology from idea, or rather from something that would be a toy car to a hundreds of billions worth of market. This takes decades, and so that's why it was very important. At the same time, of course, long-term planning is the foundation of good policy making, and therefore any country that wants to have a long-term industrial strategy and an energy strategy and bring the two things together, having a long-term planning horizon is also absolutely fundamental. And it's also useful, of course, to lower the risk for all the massive amount of investment that is needed to generate a new industry, even if now it's no longer a new industry with a new technology. It's more about catching up with another country.
질문 더 없으실까요? Are there any other questions? So if there are no further questions, we will, by the way, thank you once again for the wonderful presentation and the answers for the questions, Ms. Fernandez and Mr. Pauli. And if there are no further questions, we will take a short break. And before that, Mr. Sang-Ju Baek, Director of the International Cooperation Division at KTAP, will provide the closing remarks to conclude session 1.
Good afternoon, good morning. This is Sang-Ju Baek, who's a director of the... Can you hear it clearly? Good afternoon, good morning. This is Sang-Ju Baek, director of the International Cooperation of the KTAP. I was supposed to speak opening remark, but instead of that, I'm going to have a closing remark. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to our colleagues from the IEA for organizing this valuable session and for their continued collaboration with KTAP. Due to a slight adjustment in today's agenda, I'm pleased to take this opportunity to deliver the closing remark. And I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to both Ms. Araceli Fernandez and Mr. Leonardo Pauli for their insightful and engaging presentations. We truly appreciate your time, expertise, and valuable contribution to today's discussion. Today's session clearly highlighted that the global car industry is undergoing a profound transformation, driven by electrification, technological innovation, and evolving market dynamics. These developments are not only reshaping the automotive sector, but also have far-reaching implications for the global energy system and industrial competitiveness. The perspectives shared today have provided us with valuable insights and important directions as we navigate this transition. I hope today's webinar has served as a meaningful platform for knowledge exchange and will further strengthen cooperation between KTAP and the IEA, as well as among all participants. Thank you once again to all speakers and participants for your available time and contribution. Thank you.
So we will take a short break and we'll be back with our second session at 5:05 p.m., which is 9:05 CET. So let's meet up at session 2. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you very much for the organization. Thanks a lot for the flexibility. Thank you.
저희 10분 정도 휴식하고 두 번째 세션 참여하실 분들은 5시 5분에 다시 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 긴 시간 참석해 주셔서 감사드리고 세션 2까지 참석해 주실 분들은 계속 남아 계셔 주시면 될 것 같습니다. 5:05 p.m. So welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. A warm welcome to those who have been with us since session 1 and also to those who are just joining for session 2. So we are now moving on to our second session, Global Hydrogen Review 2025. To open this session, I would like to invite Mr. Ieawebi나, am I pronouncing it right? The head of IEA Hydrogen and Alternative Fuel Unit. So Mr. Ieawebi나, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and welcome to everyone. Good afternoon to this webinar about the Global Hydrogen Review 2025. My name is Ieawebi나. I'm head of the Hydrogen and Alternative Fuels Unity at the IEA, and I'm very delighted to have you with us today. I'm joined today by my colleague Ieawebina, who will present just in a moment the key findings of last year's Global Hydrogen Review. Just to provide some background, the Global Hydrogen Review is an outcome of the Clean Energy Ministerial Hydrogen Initiative that is supported by more than 20 countries, including Korea. So I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the Korean representatives in this initiative for their valuable feedback and insights, as well as all the reviewers and institutions that contributed to this analysis. I have to say that last year marked a special milestone for our Global Hydrogen Review. It was actually the 5th edition. And since its launch in 2021, our goal has been to track the developments in hydrogen production and demand, infrastructure, trade, policy, innovation, and investments. And the report provides an annual snapshot of the status of the sector and what could mean in the future. That way also supporting government and industry to fine-tune their hydrogen strategies. Over these years, the global conversation in hydrogen has shifted significantly. I have to say, hydrogen has moved from a niche discussion along the lines, hydrogen is the fuel of the future, and will always be that, to one where hydrogen is considered strategic opportunities for governments, a means to support them in progress towards climate targets, energy security targets, and also targets for industrial competitiveness. But after a wave of ambitious commitments from industry and governments, the sector is now facing headwinds. So headlines are no longer dominated by the opportunity that hydrogen can offer, but by project delays, cancellations, bankruptcies, and also the reduced policy ambitions. This led to a cooling of sentiment and raised questions whether hydrogen is what could be the role of hydrogen in the future energy system, and whether the enthusiasm that we are actually seeing or have seen in the past was just a hype. But I guess here it's important to separate the signal from the noise and look at the data. And if we look at the data, we're actually seeing that over the past years, the sector has made significant progress. Projects for the production of low-emission hydrogen have grown from just a few handful of demonstration projects in 2021 to more than 200 final investment decisions by the end of 2024. Global investment in low-emission hydrogen production has reached $4.3 billion in 2024. That's actually an 80% jump compared to the year before. And we also estimate that last year, based on preliminary numbers, global low-emission hydrogen production has exceeded 1 million tons of low-emission hydrogen last year. And looking ahead, based on projects that are in operation, under construction, or have reached final investment decisions, low-emission hydrogen production could exceed or reach more than 4 million tons by 2030. So there's a lot of great progress that we're actually seeing, but of course, this progress is well below the expectations set earlier by industry and governments. And hydrogen continues to face significant challenges. That's also true. So hydrogen production costs, lack of demand, regulatory uncertainty, and infrastructure gaps are all important impediments for future progress. Like other clean energy technologies, hydrogen may also face new challenges as government budget shifts towards other urgent priorities. But this is why data-driven assessment of the sector is so important. Take stock of the progress and understand the challenges ahead, not getting carried away by high expectations, nor getting discouraged by near-term setbacks. This is exactly what this year's edition of the Global Hydrogen Review has done. Once again, I have to say, it provides a comprehensive, first-of-kind assessment of what level of hydrogen adoption we can realistically achieve by the end of this decade, and offers recommendations on the priority areas for further action. The report is also complemented by online or by tracking tools, such as our production and infrastructure projects databases. And we also introduced last year a new hydrogen tracker, which will be introduced at the end of this presentation. With that said, I would hand over back, and I guess it's to Dr. Beck, and thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Remmer, for the warm welcoming remarks. So now we will move on to our second main presentation, Global Hydrogen Review 2025. To present this review, we are honored to have Mr. Jose Bermudez with us. He's an energy technology analyst and the hydrogen lead at the IEA Energy Technology Policy Division. As the co-lead author of the Global Hydrogen Review 2025, he's the perfect person to guide us through today's topic. So, Mr. Bermudez, we are ready for you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee, and good afternoon for everyone in the webinar. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and also for giving us the opportunity to present you with our report. If you give me just a second, I am going to share the slides for the presentation. Okay, can you confirm that you can see them now?
Yeah, we can see clearly.
Okay, fantastic. So I think Uwe has already given you some of the highlights of the report, but I would like to start just with a short introduction, a short recap of what's the status of the hydrogen sector today. This is the 5th edition of the Global Hydrogen Review. We started publishing the report in 2021, and we have taken this opportunity as a moment to make some sort of stock take of what has happened on the sector in the last few years. So if we go back to 2021, the hydrogen sector have gained a lot of momentum. There was a wave of ambitious government commitments and a similarly vigorous response from the private sector, with hundreds of announcements of projects for the production of low emissions hydrogen. But now, 4 years later, negative news from the sector are making headlines. And we are speaking about project delays, cancellations, and downward revisions of the commitments that governments have made for low emissions hydrogen. So while the challenges facing the hydrogen sector have led to a slower deployment than what was expected in 2021, a closer look at the data shows that rather than stalling or faltering, the sector is progressing and reaching important milestones. And let me give you just 3 examples. Back in 2021, we have only a handful of small projects for the production of low emissions hydrogen that were in operation. But since then, the production has increased by 60%, and at the end of 2025 was on track to get close to 1 million tons of production. And then when we are looking to 2030 and based only on projects that are in operation or that have reached a final investment decision or that have started construction, low emissions hydrogen production is set to surpass 4 million tons. This, again, is much lower than government and industry ambitions at the beginning of this decade, but this still represents a growth from less than 1% of total hydrogen production in 2024 to around 4% in 2030. And this would put low emissions hydrogen growth on par with the fast expansions that we have seen on other clean energy technologies in recent years, for example, in the case of solar photovoltaics. Now, projects are also becoming larger. Again, if we go back to 2021, the largest electrolyzer in operation in the world had a capacity of 30 megawatts. But early in 2025, 500 megawatts electrolyzer was commissioned in China. And the world's largest electrolyzer project under construction in the world, which is the Neon Green Hydrogen project in Saudi Arabia, has an expected capacity of more than 2 gigawatts. And finally, hydrogen technologies are also progressing, moving from small prototypes to pilot demonstration to commercialization. And this is particularly important on the demand side, as shown here in this slide for the cases of steel or shipping. We think that there are several technologies in these sectors that can reach commercialization before 2030. And this will help unlocking large demands for low emissions hydrogen. Now, despite this progress, we cannot deny that the hydrogen sector is entering a phase of consolidation. In the last few years, we have been seeing continuous growth in the potential low emissions hydrogen production that announced projects could reach by 2030. But in our assessment for 2025, we saw that this potential production declined for the first time due to projects being cancelled and particularly due to projects being postponed post-2030. The potential production fell in particularly in electrolysis projects, which were responsible of around 80% of this total decline. So when looking at the status of the projects, the drop is mainly coming from projects that are at an early development stage, when assumptions on cost reductions have been too ambitious or expectations for future market developments have been too optimistic. The reasons for companies to reduce, delay, or suspend projects can be manifold, but there are 4 reasons that stand out. First are regulatory challenges, and here we can cite unclear or complex definitions of low emissions hydrogen to be eligible for public funding, but also slow permitting processes. Then the second was the high cost of low emissions hydrogen in combination with uncertainty about criteria to secure public funding. And this impacts economics of a project and delays investments. The third was technical and supply chain challenges. For example, some electrolyzer manufacturers are facing insolvency or are scaling back operations, which can undermine confidence in the supply chain. And this increases risks not only during the project delivery, but also during future operations. And finally, many projects are struggling to secure credit-worthy offtake agreements, which is a topic that I'm going to discuss in more detail later in the presentation. Now, as I already mentioned at the beginning, the potential low emissions hydrogen production for what we call committed projects, so those that are in operation, under construction, or that reach a final investment decision, can surpass 4 million tons by 2030. And this represents around 10% of the total project pipeline. The 90% remainder of the potential production is at earlier planning phases. So with the decline that we have observed in the project pipeline in 2025, and also thinking that at the moment that we wrote the report, there were only 5 years left to 2030, now even less, we have asked ourselves how many of these projects can still be realized by 2030. And to answer this question, we have assessed the likelihood of projects being in operation by 2030, taking into account factors such as the project status, its size, the targeted hydrogen use, and the location, factoring aspects like financing costs or existing energy infrastructure in a given country. So based on this assessment, we think that an additional 6 million tons of low-emission hydrogen production has a strong potential to be in operation by 2030. But its realization will depend on government support to close the cost gap with hydrogen produced from unabated fossil fuels, but also policies to stimulate demand, particularly in existing industrial applications. And on the other end of the spectrum, around half of the potential production in the pipeline has low potential or is uncertain to be in operation by 2030. Around half of these projects are very large electrolysis projects in emerging and developing economies with low-cost renewable resources, but that lack financing potential or that have challenges to secure free offtake agreements, because these tend to be projects looking at trade and exports, and international market, as we will see later, is developing quite slowly. Now, I have just mentioned that one of the challenges is the cost. So jumping into the topic of cost, the first clear message is that the high cost of low emissions hydrogen represents the main barrier today to its adoption. In addition, in the last couple of years, for example, renewable hydrogen production costs have been going up rather than down. And this has been the result of a mix of inflation and also cost estimates becoming more realistic as projects get to more advanced stages. Today, there is a cost gap between renewable hydrogen and fossil-based production routes, but this gap differs by region. In China, the gap is relatively small thanks to lower electricity prices, but also lower cost of capital and economies of scale and experience with large construction projects, which enable low cost for the balance of plant of the electrolyzer, but also low cost for engineering, procurement, and construction, which together represents 80 to 85% of the total capex of a project. In China, the cheapest renewable hydrogen is today already at the same cost level as the most expensive hydrogen produced from fossil fuels with carbon capture. And as renewable hydrogen becomes cheaper, this overlap is expected to increase. And we think that by 2030, the cheapest renewable hydrogen could even become competitive with unabated fossil-based production. Now, for regions with cheap gas, it is much more difficult for renewable hydrogen to compete. Even though regions like the United States or the Middle East have rich renewable resources, the high capital intensity of renewable hydrogen makes it much more expensive. And although the gap is expected to decrease significantly, it's set to remain large, and CCUS is likely to be more competitive for producing low emissions hydrogen in the near term. And finally, we have regions have relatively high cost of natural gas and are import dependent, like Europe or certain countries in Latin America, and do not count with the technology and capital cost advantage of China. So the cost gap is still significant today, but it is also expected to close thanks to technology improvement and carbon pricing policies. In the best locations for renewable hydrogen production in these regions, we think that the gap could be reduced to just above $0.50 per kilogram by 2030, which of course can have important policy implications in terms of the cost of supporting these kind of projects. Delving a bit deeper in this topic of China's advantages on the production of hydrogen from renewable electricity, we know that today China is driving the deployment and manufacturing of electrolyzers. The country accounts for 2/3 of global installed electrolyzer capacity, 2/3 of the capacity that has already reached a final investment decision, but also nearly 60% of global electrolyzer manufacturing capacity. And when we look at 2030 and taking into account only committed projects, this is not expected to change significantly. So this situation mirrors its remarkable success in solar PV or in electric vehicles. So people have started to ask the question whether electrolyzers will follow the same trend as solar PV and EVs, and China will dominate the global market. So when we compare the cost of making and installing an electrolyzer in China and somewhere else, here in the slide I'm putting the example of Europe, the immediate answer may be yes. The cost of installing a Chinese electrolyzer in China are indeed 60% lower than installing a European electrolyzer in Europe. However, the equipment costs are only part of the total investment to install an electrolyzer. More than half of the total cost are for engineering, procurement, and construction, which depend on local conditions. So when taking into account also tariffs, shipping costs, and these local impacts of the cost of engineering, procurement, and construction, the cost advantage of installing a Chinese electrolyzer in Europe shrinks to 20% compared to European manufacturers. And the impact on hydrogen production is even smaller. So with electricity cost being a major component in the production cost of hydrogen, and Chinese electrolyzer today still suffering from lower efficiencies and performance, the cost advantage narrows further. And from our analysis, we have seen that the cost reduction that can be achieved varies between less than 5% to around 15%. And there are certain project configurations in which the production cost could be even higher when using Chinese electrolyzers. But this does not mean that this situation will not change in the future, because Chinese manufacturers are already investing a lot in innovation to address these performances that you have just mentioned, but also are exploring overseas manufacturing to deal with these local component costs. Now I would like to move to the topic of demand. I mentioned that this is one of the big challenges for projects to move ahead and one of the reasons why they are being delayed or suspended or cancelled. So a good indicator of momentum in the sector is the signing on of offtake agreements. The value of new signed deals fell sharply in 2024 to around 1.7 million tons compared to 2.4 million tons in 2023. And this decline mainly reflects fewer trade-oriented agreements, particularly those targeting international exports and without specified end use, which are usually preliminary and non-binding. So these are not news because the big drop is coming from deals that tend to be not really secure. So when we look at the distribution of these offtake agreements, offtake activity remains concentrated in refining, in industry, and in certain applications for hydrogen-based fuels. So together, these sectors account for 85% of total volumes and almost all of the firm agreements. Another point that I forgot to mention is that these agreements, the firm offtake agreements, in 2024 also decreased to around 20% of the total agreed volume compared to 30% in 2023. However, on a positive note, some preliminary deals from previous years were converted into firm contracts, helping to unlock investment decisions on production projects. And actually, this investment in production projects for low emissions hydrogen have been growing over the last few years, with a strong correlation to the sectors where offtake agreements are concentrated. Of course, not all FIDs are related to offtakes. Some projects are for self-consumption and do not involve signing of offtake agreements with third parties. But all these projects are either for refining or for industrial applications. So this reinforces the idea that these sectors are ready for adoption in the near term, and policy action focused on these sectors in existing hydrogen uses or in high-value applications like shipping and aviation remain the most competitive and the most effective way to scale up demand in the short term and stimulate investment on the production side. So continuing with this topic of policy, the implementation of demand policies is really needed if we want to unlock investment on hydrogen supply. I have mentioned this a few times already, but committed projects, so those that are operational under construction or that reach an investment decision, could produce more than 4 million tons of hydrogen by 2030. And this level of committed supply is slightly lower than the demand that we estimate that could be created by the policies that governments have fully implemented as of today. There is still a small gap, which is likely to be closed by 2030, with new final investment decisions that are expected to be taken in the next 2 to 3 years. However, if we also consider those projects that are yet not committed but have a strong potential to come online by 2030, so those 6 million tons that I mentioned a few slides ago, the potential production from these projects is well aligned with the sum of hydrogen policies already implemented, but also government targets for demand creation. This highlights the importance of unlocking investment in these projects to meet government ambitions. But realizing these investments hinges itself in demand policy implementation. Despite initial efforts in places such as Europe, Japan, India, or Korea, here we can cite, for example, the programs for stimulate hydrogen demand in power generation, the pace of implementation still remains slow. And this has also occurred at global level, for example, with the International Maritime Organization Net Zero Framework, which is expected to promote uptake of low-emission fuels in maritime, but its final approval was postponed at the end of 2025 and is expected for the end of this year. And moreover, policy efforts are being distributed across all sectors. So just above 50% of potential demand comes from hydrogen in existing uses in refining and industry, or the adoption of hydrogen-based fuels in applications like shipping or aviation, which, as I explained before, they are readier for large-scale uptake in the short term. Let's switch from demand to trade, which is a topic that has attracted a lot of interest lately, with a large number of projects being announced and intended for exports. If all announced projects were realized, 16 million tons of low emissions hydrogen could be traded by 2030. And this accounts for around 45% of all announced projects. This means that trade is a significant driver of project announcements, despite the uncertainty around the creation of a global market. A larger share of announced projects are electrolytic hydrogen, and less of the CCUS projects are targeting exports, since its role is still uncertain in one of the major potential import markets, such as the case of Europe. Now, only 1 in 4 trade-oriented projects have identified a potential off-taker. And I mean just identified off-taker, but not actually firm any kind of off-take agreement, which, as explained before, is very often a necessary requirement to reach a final investment decision. So using the same methodology that we apply to assess project likelihood, those already operational under construction or that have reached a final investment decision represent just over 800 kilotons, so 0.8 million tons of hydrogen, potential hydrogen trade by 2030. There is an additional 1 million tons of hydrogen that has a strong potential to be traded within this time frame, but again, only if support schemes are put in place to close the cost gap with unabated fossil-based production, and off-takers are secure. But in addition, in the case of trade, it's important the development of the delivery infrastructure, which is something that I will touch in more detail in coming slides. However, more than 75% of the announced volume from trade-oriented projects in the pipeline has low potential or is uncertain to become operational by 2030. Most of this volume comes from large electrolysis projects in emerging economies. So given the scale and the complexity of these projects, they have better prospects to be commissioned after 2030 than by 2030. So although trade is driving project announcements, the development of a global market for hydrogen trade and what can realistically be achieved by 2030 remains uncertain, meaning that export-oriented projects currently have a more challenging situation to advance to investment stage. Now, when looking at the geographical distribution of these projects, we can see that in the export side, there is a high concentration of projects in emerging economies. Most low-emission hydrogen trade projects are based in Central, South America, Middle East, or North Africa. And then on the import side, these projects are targeting exports to Europe, mainly to Germany and Netherlands, to Japan, and to Korea. In terms of the carrier to be traded, around 85% of trade-oriented projects plan to export hydrogen in the form of ammonia. And this means that almost 14 million tons of hydrogen, which is equivalent to about 75 million tons of ammonia, would be traded by 2030 if these projects are realized. And this is a significant volume. To put this into perspective, we can compare it with the current global ammonia production, which is roughly 200 million tons. And it's nearly 4 times larger than all the ammonia that is traded globally today, which is about 20 million tons. This puts again into perspective how difficult is the development of such a large market just in the next 5 years. Okay, we have talked about production, demand, trade, but for low emissions hydrogen to reach its users, we need an infrastructure to transport it. So around 37,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines have been announced to 2030, but only a small share, less than 6%, has firm investment commitments. So most of the progress so far is happening in Northwest Europe and in China, where the longest dedicated hydrogen pipelines are being built. But due to the slow progress in this part of the supply chain in the last year, we took the opportunity to look more closely at ports. Energy trade by ship is central to the global economy and a cornerstone on energy security. So ports are also expected to play a key role in the adoption of low emissions hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels for 3 reasons. First, by supporting the decarbonization of shipping. Second, by aggregating demand for low emissions hydrogen, as many chemical plants and refineries, which are large hydrogen users today, are located near ports. And third, ports can also enable trade of low emissions hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels. So we look at where announced low emissions hydrogen projects are located and how closely they are to today's main bunkering ports or ports with high traffic. Our analysis shows that almost 70% of all announced low emissions hydrogen production projects is located within 500 kilometers of a major port area. And around 130 major ports could access each of them at least 100,000 tons of low emissions hydrogen production per year from announced projects that are located nearby. If converted, for example, to methanol, that would be equivalent in energy terms to about 3% of annual bunkering today in the port of Rotterdam, which is the largest port in Europe and the third largest port in the world. However, this distribution is uneven. A higher share of tanker and dry bulk ports are located close to significant hydrogen production volumes compared with container ports. And this can have implications for the adoption of hydrogen-based fuels, because container shipping has a higher value and it would be less sensitive and more able to absorb the potential fuel price premiums linked to the use of hydrogen-based fuels. Importantly is that developing port infrastructure for hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels is needed because it's not yet completely available, but it doesn't have to start from scratch. Existing facilities and experience with handling other chemicals provide a strong foundation. And this is another aspect that we have assessed. Today, there are around 100 terminals already operating or under construction for methanol, 180 terminals for ammonia, and there are also 300 LNG liquefaction or regasification terminals and roughly 1,000 LPG terminals around the world. This shows that ports already have extensive experience handling chemicals and liquefied fuels, which is important as low emissions hydrogen-based fuels can be more complex to handle than traditional fuels. These ports that have all these available or under construction terminals are likely to be better positioned for the early adoption of low emissions fuels, as they have already in place permitting processes, trained personnel, and existing storage capacity. So to assess this readiness, we have developed a chemical handling infrastructure score, which is inspired by similar initiatives from the shipping industry. The score considers existing or under construction port infrastructure for ammonia, LPG, methanol, and liquefied natural gas. So nearly 80 ports score high on this index, which means that they have strongest readiness to potentially handle hydrogen-based fuels. And of these, 55 of them are located near significant low emissions hydrogen production projects, and 35 of them are main bunkering ports today. Many are concentrated in the Middle East, including around the Suez Canal, the US East Coast, and key parts of Europe, including Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So over the medium to long term, in the short term, these ports are better positioned to the development of this infrastructure. But over the medium to long term, however, additional ports can also develop the necessary facilities, even if they currently have a lower score, as we have seen with the gradual rollout, for example, of LNG bunkering in recent years. So let me finish with a brief explanation of the policy recommendations that we have outlined in the report. First, it is important to maintain support schemes for low emissions hydrogen production. Many projects are ready to invest if timely support helps them to close the cost gap with unabated fossil-based generation. And this can enable rapid scale-up and cost reduction. There is a need to accelerate demand creation so it can facilitate offtake, and this can underpin investments. Key opportunities in the near term are in existing hydrogen uses, such as refineries or chemicals, and also in pooling demand in industrial hubs, which can create scale and help reduce risks. Also, governments and industry can cooperate in the creation of lead markets for sustainable end-use products, which can help unlocking early-stage adoption. There is also a need to expedite the development or the deployment of hydrogen infrastructure. Infrastructure projects often take more time than originally planned, so clear regulations, financial tools, and efficient permitting can cut early investment risk and avoid further delays. We can also support early-stage hydrogen technologies with public finance instruments, which can help in reducing risks. For example, export credit agencies and public finance institutions can provide warranties for first-of-a-kind projects that seek to demonstrate and scale up novel technologies. And finally, supporting emerging and developing economies in moving up the value chain will also be important. These countries have great potential for low-cost and low-emissions hydrogen, but they face challenges in access to finance, limited infrastructure, and limited offtake, given that they are export-oriented projects. So by partnering with advanced economies, they can develop also domestic use cases, but also open export opportunities not only for hydrogen, but for hydrogen-based products, or particularly for value-added hydrogen-based products, such as fertilizers or steel. Finally, I would like to introduce you to our new online tool. We already mentioned this. It's a new online tool that we launched along the report and also with our regular project databases, which have also been updated. This tool that we have called the IEA's Hydrogen Tracker is a new data source in which you could access much more information and much more detail than the one that we can present in the report. It includes a map of operational and announced projects for low emissions hydrogen production with information about their location, size, technology, and status. It also includes data on production of low emissions hydrogen infrastructure, both historical and potential from announced projects, not only at global level, but also with a breakdown by region and country. It includes detailed analysis on today's production cost and the potential cost reductions by 2030 in different regions of the world. And finally, it includes a policy dashboard with more than 1,000 hydrogen policy measures announced or implemented worldwide since 2020. They are classified by country, type of policy, status, with the possibility to access a detailed description of each of the policies. So we invite you to visit the tool, explore it, and make sure, because we are sure that information available there can be really useful and help you on your daily work. And with that, I finish the presentation, and we are more than willing to hear from your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bermudez, for the insightful presentation. Now we have time for Q&A. Please type your questions in the chat box in English, or you can speak directly in English by using the raise hand feature. And we already have a question in the chat. So could you please address this one first, Mr. Bermudez? Please.
Yes. Yeah, so there is no region to emit liquid hydrogen in the export analysis. It's actually included. The thing is that this analysis is based by 2030. So on the projects that are announced targeting operation by 2030, there is only one for liquid hydrogen. So it's a very small share of the total pipeline. We think that there is, of course, strong potential, but it's very likely to happen at scale after 2030. It's a completely new technology, contrary to the trade of other hydrogen-based products such as ammonia or methanol. So it needs further development and demonstration. It is true that ammonia is facing some additional barriers in terms of safety, in terms of public acceptance, but we are actually seeing the first volumes already traded. No, we have seen some trade at the end of last year between China and Japan. We have seen it early this year between China and Korea. So despite those barriers, it seems that it can happen even in the short term. And it's also actually a lot of progress in standards to handle the situation a bit better. Okay, I'm reading the next one. Yeah, so the potential increase in the cost of natural gas with CCS by 2030 in the US is mostly due to the cost of natural gas. There is a lot of new LNG becoming online, but is poised to mostly to exports. And this is likely to slightly increase the cost of natural gas for industrial users in the US by 2030. Yes, so in terms of the analysis that we have done for the cost of electrolyzer, the one that we have presented is based on the share of cost for alkaline technologies. And this is because they represent today 80% of the operational capacity and also of the manufacturing capacity. So from now till 2030, which is the timeline of the analysis, it is very likely to still represent the majority of the deployments. Yes, I wouldn't say that Europe relies more in PEM technologies. It's definitely more advanced in terms of the development of the technologies. It has a larger share of PEM in the pipeline, but still the deployments are dominated by alkaline technologies. So the largest projects in Europe, and we can think about Stegra projects for the production of steel, Hydrogen Holland, the new FID from Moeve. So the largest projects in Europe are still relying on alkaline technology. And PEM is used in smaller scale projects, which have larger costs because the technology is less developed or less commercialized, but also they are reaching FIDs at smaller scale. We think that there is still a lot of innovation expected in PEM, and the cost will keep reducing. But in the next 5 years, which is the timeline of this analysis, we still think that alkaline technologies are going likely to dominate the market. Okay, and the other question about ammonia. Most of the announced projects are targeting the use of directly use ammonia in the end uses, and they are targeting the use in the fertilizer sector, so the production of other fertilizers, the production of other chemical compounds such as explosives, and also we have like a large share of the exports targeting Japan and Korea for the direct use of ammonia in the power sector. Also other uses, such as, for example, in the case of shipping, are also responsible of an important share of trade. But there are some projects, and it's not it's a smaller share than the others, but it's significant still, that are targeting the reconversion of ammonia into hydrogen. And this is particularly in the case of Europe, where the first ammonia cracker pilot has started operating at the end of last year, and more cracking capacity could become online by 2030. But this will require additional development of infrastructure. It's not enough to get ammonia to the port and crack it. There is a need to develop the hydrogen pipelines to then transport that cracked ammonia, or the hydrogen that comes from that cracked ammonia to the final users. And we are seeing some delays on the development of this infrastructure.
Are there any other questions?
Okay. So our definition of low emission hydrogen today is hydrogen produced from low emissions electricity, either renewable or nuclear, from sustainable biomass, or for hydrogen produced with fossil fuels and carbon capture and storage, as long as the CO2, so the CO2 capture is applied to all project streams. It's done at high capture rates, and then the CO2 is permanently stored and prevented to be re-emitted into the atmosphere. And we have focused quite a lot on developments on low emissions hydrogen, because they are the majority of the developments that have been announced on the industrial side. We are also aware about some policies that are aiming to use hydrogen produced from unabated fossil fuels to scale up the market, but this can have some challenges in terms of creating stranded assets in the long term as the sector shifts more into low emissions hydrogen. It can play a role in the very initial stages, and for example, to facilitate the deployment of new technologies for the end use applications of hydrogen, but it has long-term implications. So we think that policies that aim to stimulate the market and expand the market by the use of traditional unabated fossil-based routes should be very careful in making sure that the transition into these new applications are incorporated and is included in the roadmap of the application of these policies.
Are there any more questions? If there are no further questions, we will conclude today's webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us today for either one or both of our sessions. And I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to Mr. Rema and Mr. Bermudez for the outstanding presentations. So we hope to continue our close collaboration with the IEA in the future. And this concludes our webinar. So thank you for your time once again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. 모두 고생 많으셨고요. 웨비나 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 긴 시간 동안 참여해주신 분들 감사드립니다. Mr. Rema and Mr. Bermudez, you may leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot again for the offering for the webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.